Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Thanks to everyone. Welcome to CSIS. We have a great discussion today. The word innovation is omnipresent here in Washington. You hear it everywhere you go. Today, we want to expand the conversation and add a couple new words. We want to add entrepreneurship and diversity. These will be good additions, and we have two people who can really talk about it really well, particularly when it comes to the small and medium business environment that are at the heart of innovation and jobs, frankly. So we'll talk about how we get new participants and voices in the discussion and where small and medium businesses fit into the overall technology and innovation space. We're lucky to have today, and I'll give very brief bios. As always, their bios will be on our website and you can read the whole thing. As always, they're also too long. They would take up the whole panel if I read them because these guys have done so much. Asahi Pompey is the global head of corporate engagement at Goldman Sachs. She's a member of the management committee, the Global Diversity Committee, and the Sustainable Finance Steering Committee. Prior to that, she was the co-chair for compliance at Goldman Sachs, global head of investment banking. I'm bungling it, aren't I? So I'll skip. Ms. Pompey joined Goldman Sachs in 2006 and was named managing director in 2010 and partner in 2018. Prior to that, she was at Cleary Gottlieb in New York and in the Frankfurt office as well. So multinational experience. Jeff Richards joined GGV Capital in 2008 as a managing partner after spending 13 years as an entrepreneur and executive in the US and Asia. He focuses on enterprise, cloud, and marketplace investments and has led GGV's investments in too many companies for me to list in any reasonable length of time. Again, they'll be on the website. Together with Jen Holstrom, he's created GGV's Founders Plus Leaders program. And prior to joining GGV, he founded two software companies and worked in Asia and Latin America with PricewaterhouseCoopers. So great to have you both here. This is a conversational episode. You get to say whatever you want. It's live. We do have an audience and they will have some questions at the end. I thought I'd start out by asking, since March, how has the landscape changed for the business you do? How has it changed for entrepreneurs and diversity? What's different now since March? Asahi, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. First of all, I'm thrilled to be here with you and Jeff and to have this discussion about something that's really near and dear to my heart, which is the state of small businesses in America. As you know, Goldman Sachs has our 10,000 Small Businesses program, which we launched over a decade ago, a real commitment by Main Street to small businesses. And think of it as a mini MBA for small businesses that are growth oriented. And so part of the privilege that I have is to stay close to that army, that network of small businesses across the country. Now we have 9,700 small businesses. I was just on with a group of 30 of them in Chicago yesterday. I spoke to about 200 of them in the restaurant industry a couple of weeks ago. And to your point, what are we hearing from them? I think sort of three things stand out. The first one will not be a surprise to you. This is an existential moment for small businesses across the country. Whether they're trying to keep their employees safe, whether they're trying to keep their employees on payroll, whether they're trying to figure out what their capital structure would be, how they navigated rounds of PPP. So, and they're people too. So they've got families and all the other challenges that everybody else is facing as well. So I'd say one, everything that you're reading and hearing about how intense it is for small business could not be overstated. But I think there's a second part of this as well, which is this is data that was just released, government data just released last week that shows that since the start of the pandemic, new business registrations have gone up 12%. And that's an interesting thing as we think about it. What's going on there? Is it insanity to try to start a small business during this time period? What we're hearing from our entrepreneurs is this: when the economy turns down, entrepreneurs turn up. They try to find opportunity. And I'll give you two very, very brief examples. We have a small business owner in Philadelphia, and she had a brick and mortar bakery. Well, she's now pivoted that bakery to now doing mail order cookie decorating kits and selling wholesale cookies. We've had another business owner who had a technology security business that now has filed registration for a new business that's working with Amazon on tracking and logistics. And so you're finding that small business, even in the intense pressure that they're under, they're finding ways to pivot and be nimble. And the last thing I'd say is we surveyed our 10,000 small business owners, and 96% of them told us that the changes they're making in their business are in fact for the long term. So these aren't just short-term fixes to get them through, but they think that a lot of these changes, they're not going back. I had a business owner, he said, I did large corporate catering events. That's not happening. I've switched to micro weddings and I'm not going back.
So I want to turn to Jeff, but let me ask you something. I've been thinking about it because it's an indicator of people's appetite for risk. And so do you think that the environment we're in now, where people are more willing to take risks, or maybe are more, it's more necessary to take risks than they were, say, a year ago?
Yeah, I think that second part, Jim, where it becomes more necessary to take risk, as well as they're rethinking things more generally.
Yeah. Jeff, how about you? What have you seen in the last 6 months? And maybe you can talk a little bit about where technology can help the small businesses, because that's one of the themes we want to touch on all day.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been quite a year, right? We're all working from our homes and using Zoom religiously. I'd say a couple of things. One, to Sahi's point, we are seeing an incredible resiliency among SMBs. You're seeing quite a few that are really challenged, particularly those that are competing against larger public brands. I would highlight the restaurant industry as an example, where you've got small mom and pop restaurants, whose balance sheets are primarily their own savings, competing against large restaurant chains like Starbucks or Chipotle or Shake Shack that are public and have access to billions of dollars. And by the way, can borrow capital at record low interest rates, whereas our local small businesses cannot. So one of the real challenges that we've seen pop up this year is just access to capital. Can I finance my business? Obviously, we had the PPP loans and the CARES Act, which I think was a very strong hand to help a lot of folks survive throughout a very challenging summer. But where do we go from here, right? When I talk to SMBs, the big question today is, where do we go from here? What happens over the next 6 to 12 months? And so that's an important part of the equation. And then to your point, Jim, we've seen an incredible surge in adoption of technology among small businesses. And if you look at the public markets, have pushed the stock prices up of companies like Square or Zendesk or Wix or Shopify, these companies that are providing technology to small merchants to help them compete in the market. And then also post-pandemic, help them offer new products and services. So if you were a local boutique selling clothing or furniture, you suddenly had to be much more active in selling online because people couldn't physically come into your store. If you were running if you're a therapist or a doctor, you suddenly adopted telemedicine. If you were, a small restaurant, you adopted takeout and delivery. So these are all things that are driven by technology. So we've probably seen a 3 to 5 year acceleration of technology adoption by small businesses. And fortunately, the small business technology economy is there. I mean, 10 years ago, we didn't have a small business technology economy. There were only a couple of companies that really sold technology into small businesses. Today, you have thousands of venture-backed companies who that is their primary focus. And we think will play a huge role, not only this year, but into next year, both with technology. And one of the things we can get into is the access to capital. You're seeing the technology providers sort of fill in for the community banks that used to provide the role of lending capital to small businesses. And you're seeing companies like Square and Shopify and others actually provide the lending and capital capabilities that small businesses need to build and operate their business.
Yeah, Square is becoming one of my favorite companies to watch. So along with Shopify and with Spotify, which is a completely different category. So we're seeing new entrants.
Yeah, and I think the financing, if you think about the community banking industry in the US, it's shrunk by more than half in 20 years. In 1990, we had over
Yeah.
13,000 community banks. Today, we have less than 5,000 with under 500 million in assets. So those were the local merchants, local banks that used to lend to your local merchant. They're gone, right? Under the wave of consolidation in the banking industry, most of those local banks are gone. And so you're seeing the technology providers like a Shopify, like a Square, step in. They have access to incredible data about the operation of these small businesses. They have confidence in them as technology adopters, and they're able to lend capital to them, in some cases in partnering with banks. But if you look at Square Capital alone last year, and we were an investor in Square when it was a private company, it's a terrific company. Last year, they lent over $2 billion to SMBs, and this year handled over $800 billion in PPP loans. So without Square, do those SMBs get access to that capital? Certainly not as quickly and effectively as they did through Square. So it's great to see the technology companies, not only, as Toby, the CEO of Shopify, likes to say, arming the rebels, arming the upstarts in these categories, but also providing them with literally a lifeline, which is the capital to invest and grow their business.
Who would have thought that go ahead, Asahi. I was just going to make a joke, so we can hold on it.
Oh, I want to hear it.
No, I was just going to say, who would have thought Star Wars would become the cultural phenomena of the century? But I was going to turn to you and say, you talk to as many small and medium-sized companies and businesses as there are, as much as anyone. What are you hearing from them when they talk about access to capital, access to technology? What's their take on it?
I think Jeff's exactly right in terms of the role that alternate finance providers are having in the market. One bright spot, I have to say, has been CDFIs. CDFIs have been there and we work with a number of them. Goldman Sachs has provided capital, $775 million since the start of the pandemic, specifically working with CDFIs because our business owners have told us, look, they are the last mile lender and they're at the last mile. And the CDFIs have really been able to penetrate in communities of color, where a lot of business owners really don't have those banking relationships. So I'd say that's been one bright spot we're hearing in terms of access to capital. But they're also saying we need more, and we need more flexible capital. Yes, we want capital that can keep individuals on payroll, but we're also thinking for the long term of our business. We want to be able to have some flexibility in terms of use of that capital to really invest in our business for the long term, in addition to payroll, which has been, very much of the sort of capital focus thus far. Another thing I wanted to double click on that Jeff said is around the role of technology, the technology revolution we've seen with small businesses. One of the areas they're worried about, and I think this isn't being talked about as much as it should in the context of small businesses, is cybersecurity. So I've had any number of small businesses that said, pre-pandemic, I didn't really get that much personal identifying information about my customers. But we're doing so much more now digitally that I'm now the keeper of that information. And I feel a tremendous sense of responsibility to safeguard that information. And I really have to get the tools and structures in place to really be, cybersecurity wasn't on if you'd asked me at the beginning of 2020, these businesses say, was cybersecurity really high on my list? A number of them said, no, not really. But now it's really sort of swung to the top of the list. Jeff, I'm not sure if you're seeing, similar things in the entrepreneurs that you're talking to as well.
Yeah, for sure. And there are public companies like CrowdStrike and others that have done very well this year because of the concerns you raised. I think the other thing on the cybersecurity front is you're seeing companies flock to the top merchant platforms. So if you're working with a Square, you're working with a BigCommerce or a Shopify or Wix, you're working with companies that have industry-leading security certification. I think it makes it harder for the smaller players in the tech industry because they may not have that security clearance. But there's no question the cyber criminals, they're always one step ahead. Everybody goes to work from home. That didn't go unnoticed, right? How much security do people have in their homes? Not much. But I think it's, honestly, for most SMBs, as long as they're working with high quality technology providers, they're going to get the kind of security that they need. I just think the access to capital is the biggest issue today. I just don't. I tweeted out a few months ago, and in August, Google was able to borrow $10 billion at 0.45% interest. Now, Google has $120 billion on its balance sheet and generated $30 billion in net income in 2019. Do you think Google really needed to borrow $10 billion or just could because it was so cheap? Meanwhile, your local small business struggles to borrow $100,000 at 15% interest. So somehow, I mean, it's capitalism at work, right?
Yeah.
Google's a very solid borrower versus an SMB that looks like a high risk borrower. But somehow we've got to make that more equitable, or our small businesses, by the way, 60% of Americans work for a small business. Small businesses are 40% of US GDP. So if we can't make it easier for small business to access capital, we're going to have a real problem as we head into 2021 and beyond.
And we've got data that really
go ahead.
substantiates what you're talking about, because when I look across the data, we've been surveying our 10,000 small business entrepreneurs. We've actually done 5 surveys since the start of the pandemic, and they really bear out this access to capital point. So 88% have exhausted their PPP loan funding. It's gone. And, for very many of them, time is running out. Another 32% of them have laid off employees and cut wages. But here's the thing that I think is the most sobering, and it really, I think, lays bare this access to capital point. 30% of them say that they will exhaust cash reserves by the end of this year. And 30% of them. And so if you think about that, laid across the families, the network, the community, the main street, that ripple impact of that single business owner having exhausted capital, I can't underscore more. I think Jeff's exactly right. Like, access to capital is just paramount.
Yeah. So what do you hear from these companies? What sort of policies do they want to see out of Washington or their state governments? I mean, what's the desire? This is Washington, where we are obsessed with policy. What do they want to see?
So, Jeff, do you want to
go ahead?
Don't look at me.
Okay. I wasn't sure if Jeff was jumping in there. No, so they're telling us a number of things that they'd like. What we did is we had a virtual summit in a couple of months ago at Goldman Sachs, where we had 2,200 of our business owners meet with 400 plus congressional officers in the month of June. And that was our flash digital summit. And we said, you know what we want? We want small businesses to have a seat at the table. For anybody who's listening that's a Hamilton fan, I want to be in the room where it happens. Small businesses need to be in the room where it happens, in the room where the decisions are being made. And we created this forum to sort of bring them together with policymakers to say, what are your needs? And we're hearing a number of things from them. One is, as I mentioned before, they need more capital, but they want also more flexibility in terms of being able to use that capital.
Yeah, I would add right now, Jim, one of the biggest issues for the small business owners that I talk to is just clarity. They don't know what the policies are going to be. Obviously with the COVID pandemic, we're dealing with something that our country's never dealt with before. But, I live in California, and we have widely varying, sort of issues and cases around COVID. And one of the biggest challenges, I know a number of folks who own restaurants, they don't know what the policies are going to be this winter. So we've been using outdoor dining all summer and fall, and it's been great in California because it's very easy to dine outside and relatively safe. What happens in winter when it's cold, and certainly in cities like New York or Chicago or Seattle, where it's cold and raining and snowing, they don't know what the policies are yet. And so I think that's one of the challenges that we've seen is the lack of coordination between federal and state government has been a little bit of a challenge for small business owners, and that they just don't know what the policies are going to be. And maybe the answer is we just don't know. But that uncertainty is incredibly difficult when you're a small business owner, as Asahi mentioned, funding a company with your life savings, which 39% of small business owners have their own savings in their business. For public companies who have access to debt and lots of capital on their balance sheet, they can sort of ride out a quarter or two. But I think that's the existential threat that we see, is these small business owners who are literally funding it with their own capital, trying to keep the people on their payroll. And they don't quite know what the policies are going to be over the next 3 to 6 months. That's the biggest challenge.
I'd add that Liability Shield is really top of mind for a number of our small businesses. We have our Goldman Sachs 10,000 Small Businesses Voices platform, which is sort of the advocacy arm. And Liability Shield has come up a number of times. So just wanted to add that as well.
What do you mean by Liability Shield? You mean COVID, or you mean broader? What's the...
Yeah, in terms of whether it's the landlord, whether it's COVID, they want to make sure that they're trying to pursue this business, but they worry about the litigation that could potentially come, whether it's from COVID or elsewhere.
Yeah, safety of their workers, safety of their patrons, just an extreme level of caution, but they aren't quite sure. And remember, you're running a small business with 10 employees. You don't have a high paid attorney on staff to advise you what you can and cannot do. And so I think these are just really difficult times for small businesses that don't have access to resources to give them guidance.
So is now a good time to start a business? I mean, what would you, if you were starting a business, what would you do?
Well, I just wrote a post about this on LinkedIn. Asahi gave a stat earlier. New business applications in 2020 are up 40% versus 2019. Now, a lot of that is out of necessity, right? When unemployment spikes, you see people sort of out of necessity say, well, I'm going to launch a new business. But we would also argue that a lot of that is because it's never been easier to start a new business, right? You can literally, the three of us could get together and have a website live tomorrow and be selling t-shirts with a slogan from our conference today. So it's never been easier to launch a small business. Now, does that mean that you're going to be successful? The hit rate may not be higher than it has been historically, but it's never been easier to launch a small business would be one thing I would point out. The second thing I would say is...
And you attribute that to technology.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. You can, all the tools you need to launch a business tomorrow, you've got at your fingertips. You can launch a website, you can launch an e-commerce platform, you can have point of sale. You've got a supercomputer in your hand. I mean, remember 10 years ago, most small business owners didn't even have a computer in their shop or an internet connection. But the iPhone really changed the game for small business in America. Second thing I would point out is, we do think there are going to be some massive changes in the way our economy and our society works. And we're going to see, just like we have in every other downturn, 08, 09, I was here for 9/11, 20 years ago. Out of that comes a whole bunch of societal changes, and you see huge opportunity areas for new entrepreneurs. And we're already seeing that today. We're seeing pitches for ideas and businesses that we wouldn't have even thought of 12 months ago, but they're sort of post-pandemic. Think about like the home fitness market. That market was tiny going into COVID. Obviously, you've had companies like Peloton that have done very well, Tonal, Mirror. There's going to be a boom in personal fitness instructors who teach people over Zoom and Facebook video and other means. And so there's all kinds of opportunity there. And then the third thing I would say is, I think there's a very strong chance the economy comes back strong in 2021, just because think about all the people who love going to restaurants and concerts and sporting events. We're social creatures, right? We want to get out and interact with other people. And I think the minute it's safe to do that, I think you're going to see a lot of folks, not to mention the travel industry, which obviously has been crushed. I think you're going to see a huge boom when it's safe to do so. Now, hopefully that's soon. But knock on wood, it'll be in 2021 at some point, and there'll be a lot of new small businesses that can take advantage of that.
One other area I'd mention is sort of mental health services. Whether you're the youngest person in the household or the oldest person in the household, we've all been impacted by COVID-19 in various ways, and some people are able to absorb those shocks, more so than others. And so what we're also seeing is just a plethora of businesses saying, "I'm here to meet that need. I'm here to meet that mental health need, whether it's counseling online or groups that are done virtually." And so that's another one, a bit sobering, but important one as well.
So both of you who've lived in other continents, in Europe and in Asia, and we were on a call this morning with some European officials, and they said one of the things they admire about the U.S. and is that companies can start here. This gets to the point that both of you raised. You can start here, but you can fail, and it's not considered essential that you go off and commit harakiri or something after that. What are you hearing from companies? What are they thinking about? How important is this attitude towards risk and failure and driving what we're seeing? Because a lot of these are new entrants, right? They're not people who are necessarily thinking of starting a business, say, a year or two ago. So what does this say about attitudes towards risk, and particularly maybe comparatively? I know you're both focused on the US, but what are we talking about here when it comes to attitudes towards failure?
Jim, I think your point in terms of it really differing around the world is really true, because we also have our 10,000 Women platform, and I run that as well. And through that, we've worked with over 10,000 women entrepreneurs, and that program is really geared towards the developing world. And so, in fact, the last trip that I took for work was coming back from South Africa, where I was meeting with 300 of our 10,000 women graduates at the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, and we did a number number of events with them. I remember wondering when I would get back into the country. It was around March 14th. And they were talking about their evolution. I was in China in November meeting with our 10,000 women graduates in China. I was there with our CEO, David Solomon. We had around 400 Chinese women entrepreneurs at Tsinghua University that we met with as well. And so as you think about sort of attitudes towards failure, one, I think, part of it may be, obviously different cultures have different sense of it, but I think you can then start again, right? The ease with which you could potentially start again, those business registrations is part of it. I think in addition, there's, teaching in schools around, kids, you can fail and you fail a few times. And so I think part of it is sort of tied to that sort of American ethos of, keep on going and keep on trying. But around the world, we're seeing business owners, a number of them that I met with in South Africa and in China, they were on their second or third business as well. And the first business may have done, provided some seed capital. So I'm wondering if there's greater universality to that notion of, starting either multiple businesses as well.
Before we go to Jeff, let me just ask, how much do you think the smartphone has changed that, or the mobile phone? So certainly you hear that a lot in Africa. Is that the key technology for these companies to use anymore, these people to use?
Absolutely. I mean, I was at the World Bank in David Malpass had a group of individuals, and we were talking about our work with entrepreneurs around the globe. And it was an amazing group of people at the World Bank last fall. And the number one thing that people mentioned all around, whether it was being able to make payments more easily, being able to track your shipments more easily, that whether you're in the smallest village, that you were somehow able to access the capital markets from that phone, could not overstate that.
Yeah, Jim, I would add a couple thoughts. One, I'm thrilled to hear you say that the Europeans recognize that culture in the US is alive and well, because I do think it's been the hallmark of Silicon Valley for decades, right? You can come out here, you can start a company, you can fail, and you can get back up. I did it. I had a company that failed in the dot-com bubble and was able to raise capital again and start a new company. So it's been the hallmark of not only Silicon Valley, but the American economy for a very long time. And I hope that never goes away. I think that, back to the point I made earlier about how did the small business tech economy grow? It really started, if you look at, there were three things that came together. AWS launched in 2005. That's Amazon Web Services, which made it easy to host and run cloud computing infrastructure. So you don't have to build and run that yourself. My first company I started in 1997, we actually had to build and run our own data centers. It was crazy. So AWS was a big driver. Then you had the iPhone launched in 2008 and the App Store in 2010, which put a supercomputer in the hand of every small business owner, most of whom did not have access to technology in their shop before that. And the third one is the integration of finance and banking capabilities with companies like Stripe and Braintree, which is now part of PayPal. That unlocked a whole bunch of potential for small businesses where suddenly they could get, we talked about Square Capital earlier, but also the ability to do billing and payment online, the ability to track receivables, track shipments, all these different components that weren't viable literally 10 years ago. You couldn't do that 10 years ago. And so that is now happening all over the world, right? You look at what's happening in India with Reliance Jio rolling out a free cellular network. You've got hundreds of millions of people suddenly basically coming into the internet economy. One of the things we like to talk about is there's 7.5 billion people in the world. There's only 330 million in the US. So what's happening is this technology that has been adopted here over the last decade by small businesses is now making its way into all these other countries. For example, there's a company in Europe that is sort of the Square of Europe called Adyen. It's now a $40-50 billion public company. So there are these same technologies and these same capabilities are popping up around the world to give people access to banking, to logistics and supply chain, to telemedicine, to all the things, e-commerce, all the things that have helped our economy thrive over the last 10 years. And again, it's back to the reason why we're so bullish on the SMB economy going forward. If we can fix some of these issues we talked about, access to capital and sort of policy and things like that.
What would you suggest? Let me rephrase that. What would you suggest for the US to do to accelerate things? I mean, it's in legislation now. There's lots of bills about accelerating innovation. There's a big effort in the national security community. I'm not always entirely sure about that, but at least the effort's there. what would you tell Americans they ought to be doing? And that includes not only expanding the number maybe of startups, but also getting it diversified a little bit, both by gender and by other metrics. So give me your advice. This is your big chance to tell Washington where to get off.
I don't think I would be a good elected official. I don't have the background or the knowledge for it. But I think, if I just speak for the SMB, if I just speak for the small business owner and say, what would I want, right? I want it to be easy to set up my business, right? Regulation, there's a cost to setting up a business, whether you're a hair salon or a restaurant, you've got insurance, you've got liability concerns. So the more we can do to make it easy for small business owners to set up and run their business, the better. And I don't have specifics just because I don't spend a lot of time on policy, but that would be number one. I think you would hear that from all small business owners. Number two, how do we help them get more access to capital? How do we get back to a mode? I mentioned earlier, there were 12,600 community banks in 1990. There's 5,000 today. So 7,500 community banks went away that were lending capital to small merchants. How do we replace that? Do we make it easier for the PayPals and Shopifys and Stripes to lend capital to their customers? How do we replace that community banking component that went away? And again, I don't have the answer. I know anecdotally it's harder for small businesses to borrow capital today than it was 20 years ago, and we have data to prove it. And then the third thing I would say is make them important, right? I think what you saw with the PPP and the CARES Act was a focus on small business, but then we also saw a whole bunch of big companies come in and take advantage of that program. And so I think the more we can continue to create programs that are focused on small business, the better. Because let's remember, while big companies have lobbyists in Washington, your local restaurant owner doesn't. And so somebody's got to look out for those folks because, again, 60% of the US workforce works for these small businesses. We've got to help these folks survive as we move forward into next year.
How about you, Asahi?
Yeah, you alluded to a point in terms of diversity. And, I think the pandemic has really laid bare sort of the pandemic within the pandemic, which is racial disparities and gender disparities that exist, and certainly they exist as it relates to whether a small business can take flight or not. And so we have some proprietary data from our 10,000 Small Business Program, which kind of bears this out, where we saw over 10 years of longitudinal study that Black business owners had a rejection rate for bank funding that was 3 times greater than their white counterpart, even if they had the same amount of revenues in their business. So even normalizing for that. They were seeing greater dips in their headcount. They have less cash reserves. They are, in a COVID environment, even more concerned about reopening than their white counterparts. By contrast, if you look at the credentials of the small business owners, we actually found that Black women business owners were the most educated group in the entire population, with 86% of them having at least a bachelor's degree. But when you contrasted that with their median revenue, they were earning 47 cents on the dollar to their white business owner counterpart. Now, there's lots else going on in this.
Wait, you said 47
cents.
47.
Right. And so you're thinking, well, we've got this, can you educate yourself out of inequity? And this sort of says no, that yes, having that bachelor's degree, Black women business owner is fantastic. But there are other headwinds as well. So as I like to say, we're all, facing the same storm, but we're not in the same boat. And I think a fundamental realization, adding on to ease of, how to start a business, access to capital, most definitely, but greater equity in the system. The last thing I'd say on this particular point is if you look at what are the rates of entrepreneurship in minority communities, they're actually extraordinarily high, right? With upwards of 20% in the Black community, 13% in the Latino community. So there's lots of activity, but is that activity really falling on fertile ground in terms of getting the capital that they need to grow their business, getting the mentorship, getting the network? And that's part of what we've been trying to do with Goldman Sachs 10,000 Small Businesses, is to provide that education, network, capital, and now also, as I mentioned before, advocacy through our 10,000 Small Businesses Voices platform, where we really get business owners talking to policymakers.
They wanted me to ask you what explains the disparity, but I'm not going to touch that one. Instead, I'm going to ask a little more positive. What do we do to change this? Is it the same set of policies, or are there specific policies you need? How do we build a more equitable entrepreneurship environment?
Sure, I love that question. I think there's sort of three things in particular. I think one is the fact that we're having an open discussion about it. And I have to say, over the last several months, where people are actually looking at this data, they're asking that follow-up question, what's really going on? So one is recognizing it, naming it, knowing that it's happening. Now, what are the systems in place that are allowing this to happen? Do we need a second look in terms of review of applicants to make sure that they're being treated as they should be treated? Are we really, generally they're asked for more paperwork, right? Some of the conversations we've had with them, they said, well, I've had to go back and, the paperwork I gave wasn't sufficient. I had to come back and give additional paperwork that the other business owners weren't being asked to provide. And so we're seeing there's a lot once you get into the conversation of what's happening in the room, business owners will tell you. So I think having an open dialogue with legislatures and others, with our business owners, where they can freely say, here's the experience that we're having. Here's our lived experience. We're part of the American dream. We want to start a phenomenal business as well. And in fact, our communities need it. The last thing I'd say to this is, if you look at the pool of minority entrepreneurs, they tend to be business leaders. So upwards of 72% of them in our study shows that in addition to being an entrepreneur, they mentor individuals in their community. They're a leader in their community. They're involved in the community board. They're involved in the community council. And so there's a double bottom line, in fact, in investing in these business owners, because they're not only providing a service to the community in their economic realm, but also as mentorship, as leaders within that community as well. So I think unpacking all of that as a sort of package, if you will, of why this is so critical to invest in minority businesses, I think is particularly important.
Yeah, Jim, I'd add one thing that I think, I agree with Asahi, like over the last 6 to 9 months, in particular with the BLM movement, we've seen a huge introspection of companies looking at themselves and saying, why have we not made more progress around diversity? And it's pretty, I'm seeing it in our portfolio. I know it's happening in larger tech companies, but sometimes you got to get more aggressive, and the free market just doesn't take care of itself. And so you probably saw in September, California passed AB 979, which requires diversity on boards. And, if you look at California, our community here in California, 39% of the residents are Latino. But 87% of the companies don't have any diversity on their board. So it's just like we're not even within percentage points of it being representative of the population. And so at some point, you have to take action and force people to do the right thing. So I think it's a combination of companies realizing this is the right thing to do. Diverse companies are better companies. We know that. The data shows us that. But how do we get there? And we're pushing that as investors, the boards that we sit on. We're trying to push more diversity at the board level as well as in the executive teams. And then sometimes it requires policy changes. So I applaud what our governor did with AB 979 and just saying, hey guys, we've had decades to work on this, and now we're going to mandate it.
I remember, Jeff, to that point, when our CEO, David Solomon, at Davos in January said that Goldman Sachs would IPO a company that didn't have at least 2 diverse board members. It made news across the street, and we've seen any number of individuals since saying that's exactly what we need to do. So I think this point around board service is an important one. I think another thing I'd mention is programs specifically focused on minority businesses. Those programs tend to show results. And they tend to work because that lens is specifically focused on minority businesses. And we have our launch with Goldman Sachs, which is an investment, a $500 million investment. And we've most recently launched a Black and Latinx cohort of that $500 million commitment to invest in minority portfolio managers and businesses. And so I think companies, walking the walk, by rolling out programs and initiatives that are sustained. I always say it has to be consistent and persistent, and not just sort of a flash for a headline, but something that's sustained. 10,000 Small Businesses has been around over a decade. So really staying with it to really see that progression.
So both of you probably noticed that international is our middle name. So I want to come back. You both have international experience. How does the rest of the world stack up on this? Where would you place them on the issues of entrepreneurship, risk? We've talked about the attitudes towards risk, on diversity. What do you hear when you talk to women in South Africa? What's sort of the global picture here?
When I speak to women in South Africa, I'm struck by several things. One is the diversity of their businesses. So some of these women were doing, businesses helping kids in shanty towns in their education or their after school. Others had a hairdressing salon. Other women were baking goods for women who were going to work, and they were, feeding elderly relatives, and they were doing deliveries. Another person had a service where, if your family was further away and someone was incarcerated, they were making food to feed the prisoners, because certain prisons around the world, as you may or may not know, don't provide food to the individuals that are there, or very minimal food to them. So I think I was struck in particular by the diversity of businesses from our business owners, whether it was South Africa or China. In India, which is another sort of huge market, we have almost 2,000 business owners that we've worked with through our 10,000 Women program in India. There, what we're seeing is lots on the technology front, of course, but we're seeing a lot in education. We're also seeing a lot in the arts, which has been fun to see, where we're seeing, sort of shrines that are being rebuilt or decorated, and women are being selected, and our women entrepreneurs for their art to be included in that. One of our women was recently featured in a campaign related to that. And so I think the diversity of business, and some of this can be quite small. And so some of these businesses are, 2 to 3 individuals that are part of that business. And the rapidity, how quickly they're able to grow that business, is another thing that we're really struck by, because we chart these businesses over time. And some of them, one of them had come to our Goldman Sachs office as part of the program 10 years ago. And she said she wanted to, in Uganda, fashion her studio after what she saw in the office. And 7 years later, she was back to show that, this is how she'd organized her space based on what she'd seen participating in the program in New York. So I would say the diversity of businesses, I think the rapidity of growth in those businesses, I think the women mentoring others. 9 out of the 10 women in our group mentor at least 8 other women in their community. So again, to that blast radius, that ripple effect of helping a single woman entrepreneur, I think those are the things that really move us, and me in particular, and really stand out.
Yeah, Jim, it really varies by country. I guess a couple things I would highlight is, if you look at the demographics, take Africa as an example. I mean, the younger population in Africa, I don't have the stats right in front of me, but you're literally talking about, I believe, something around half or more than half the population is under the age of 40 in a continent with 1.2 billion people. So the opportunity for technology companies to work with that population, I mean, those are folks who are digital natives. They're going to grow up with an iPhone in their pocket. They're going to think of access to the internet as something that is normal. To me, creates a lot of optimism. And we're starting to see venture capital firms focus on Africa. We're starting to see banks spend more time and energy in Africa. Part of the problem you have in some of these countries is the banking system is literally non-existent. So to Asahi's point, as an entrepreneur, getting access to capital or credit was just not feasible 10 years ago. And in some countries, not even 5 years ago. And so you're seeing companies we're an investor in a company called Tala, which is providing microloans in Kenya and the Philippines and Mexico City. So if you're an entrepreneur who needs to borrow $20 or $100 to get a business started and run it, you can do that through them. That didn't exist in the traditional banking system. It wasn't available. And so I think getting access to credit and banking is such an important part of the startup economy around the world. You're seeing that in Africa. You're seeing more of it in India. One of the interesting stats about India, there's over $1 trillion sitting in gold in household wealth in India, physical gold.
No, I know.
And so we're an investor in a company that's trying to help unlock that and let people borrow against that gold. Because think about it, you got people literally sitting on thousands of dollars worth of gold that they can't do anything with. It's just sort of a reserve for their family. So unlocking some of these areas where there's capital, we need to have capital available to create businesses. And so it's a hugely important part of the equation. And then to Asahi's point, education outside the US, the rise of digital education has been much faster and much more prevalent than it has in the US. So you've got literally hundreds of millions of people in China, India, Southeast Asia, and Africa who are learning languages, they're learning math skills, they're learning all kinds of things online. And they've been doing it for years. Now we're sort of becoming aware of it here because we were forced into a work from home mode with the pandemic, and all of our kids are learning on Zoom. That's been happening in other countries around the world for years. And so I believe that one of the really cool trends you're going to hear a lot about over the next 2 to 3 years, particularly coming from China, India, and Southeast Asia, is the rise of online education and people getting access. You know, you've heard the phrase, I'm sure, talent is universal, opportunity is not. Well, if you democratize education and put it on the internet, make it available to everyone, theoretically, we should see people coming from everywhere around the world to learn and start new companies and prosper in ways that they haven't had access to previously because it was a very tightly controlled system around education. So that's a whole other tangent. We could do another session on education, but I'm super bullish based on what I'm seeing with the portfolios. We have about 15 portfolio companies in that space, and the hundreds of millions, literally hundreds of millions of consumers that they're serving in these markets.
Yeah, my kid was talking to me about that this morning because his university has put all their courses online, right? And so he said, what would happen if we just opened it up to everyone? That would be kind of interesting, you know?
Be amazing.
Interesting
Yeah.
that.
Huh?
It's interesting because we did that at Goldman Sachs. So in March, we have our 10,000 women curriculum, and we decided that we would revamp it, put it online, free of charge. Any woman entrepreneur around the world would be able to take the course. And I have to say, when I huddled with my team before we, decided to put it on Coursera, I said, if we build it, will they come? And 70,000 women entrepreneurs around the world have enrolled since March in over 100 countries. And so to this point about education and hunger for education around how to propel their business, the finance module has been sort of the rock star module that we see individuals accessing, as well as marketing, as well as negotiation. So that gives you a sense of the sort of 3 key areas that our entrepreneurs around the world are really interested in. And one other thing around this access to capital around the world, we partnered Goldman Sachs 5 years ago with the World Bank and the IFC to launch an investment facility, the WeOff facility, with a gender lens. And last year we celebrated the 5th anniversary of that and came out with a report around that that's on our website that you can see. But the headline of that was investing with a gender lens, whether it was Vietnam, the Philippines, around the world. $1.45 billion have been deployed already as part of that WeOff facility. And what we were finding is that women entrepreneurs were a great investment, right? They were paying back at higher rates. They were an excellent credit. And we hoped the data would show that when we launched it, but it bore that out in spades 5 years later. And so now during the pandemic, with even more need for capital, that facilities with a gender lens like the Goldman Sachs IFC WeOff facility, I think is one that can kind of lead the way in terms of where we need to go in developing countries with entrepreneurs.
What are the barriers that you think COVID has broken? And education's one. But this isn't on my script, by the way, but listening to you, we've all had different, but whether it's the Zoom and the virtual conferencing or work from home or the courses online, what are the things that COVID has broken, and broken in a good way? I mean, ceilings that aren't there anymore and that give us new opportunities. What would you, just off the top of your head, what would you point to?
Look, I think we're spending more time indoors, right? We're spending more time indoors. We're spending more time behind a computer. We're seeing our children on computers all the time. And so if you're an entrepreneur and you're thinking about, as your kids are studying, you'll get on and say, you know what, they're up at night doing their homework. Mom's going to get up at night too. I've wanted to maybe brush up on my finance module. So I think just the setting of it all has done that. The other thing is entrepreneurs are always looking for opportunity. It's in their DNA. They're always looking to sharpen the sword. And so here, where you see that so many businesses are failing, people are also thinking, where's the opportunity? And can I seize on that opportunity? We know that in periods of disruption are ways where ideas are born and they then transform the industry for years to come. And so I think you've got a lot of sharp minds and entrepreneurs that are thinking not only how dire the situation is, but where's the opportunity? And they want to be the one that capitalizes on that.
Yeah, I'd give you a couple thoughts, Jim. So one, we talked about digital education. I think this year will be the straw that broke the camel's back of the existing education system. And We will see better access to education through digital. You're seeing the venture capital industry has put tens of billions of dollars into driving this trend, but there wasn't a forcing mechanism. And now you have a forcing mechanism, which I think not only are we seeing kids learn to learn remotely, but hopefully we will see more people get access to the kind of education that you could get from, say, an Ivy League school, but that was only open to 50,000 people a year. So that's one. Two, telemedicine. I mean, the adoption of telemedicine, it spiked, 10x year over year because people couldn't physically go to the doctor's office. And I was speaking with a physician earlier this week who told me it has dramatically taken up compliance among his older patients because it's easy for them to just pick up and look at their iPhone for 15 minutes and do a chat with him versus actually getting a ride from a family member or whatever to go 10 miles to the doctor, sit in a waiting room for an hour. The adoption of telemedicine should make the entire healthcare system way more efficient than it has been. The third one is e-commerce. I mean, e-commerce was growing in the US. It was about 16% of retail sales in January. It doubled in 4 months. And all kinds of folks around the country, whether it's food delivery or shopping or whatever. And by the way, this is not just benefiting Amazon, it's benefiting all the merchants on Etsy, the merchants on eBay, the folks who are on Shopify and BigCommerce. Literally millions of merchants around the country and around the world are benefiting from that boom. So that's a good trend. And then the last one is digital fitness. I mean, the fitness industry, not only in the US, but around the world has been growing, but not growing at like an insane rate. And all of a sudden, to Asahi's point, when people are stuck at home, and they can't go to the gym, they have found other ways to engage with other consumers, make it a social experience, make it entertaining like you've seen happen with Peloton. And we think that trend will go for a long time. If you look at China, China has 400 million millennials. The millennial population in China is bigger than the population of the US. Those folks are rabid about fitness. And so you're seeing a whole category in China. Fitness as a category didn't really exist in China 10, 20 years ago. So I think that trend is here to stay, and it's one that'll be a global phenomenon.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It used to get really funny looks when you went jogging in China, but not anymore. So that might be a good note to end up on because we're coming close to our time and I want to be respectful of your time. But what's the future for small and medium businesses? What's the future for entrepreneurship? And the corollary to that is what's the technology that fits into that future of entrepreneurship? So I don't know who wants to go first, but when you think about, looking 5 years out, 10 years out, what does it look like? And the way I describe this to people sometimes, because we have a fair number of people who are risk averse in Washington, is how does the world change when you have Einstein in your pocket? When you have access to cloud and artificial intelligence, these are good things, right? What does it look like when you have 5G networks that allow you to create all sorts of new applications, beyond Angry Birds, right? Angry Birds is cool, not denigrating it, but what are we looking at? So what do you see the future for entrepreneurship we've talked a lot about how to get there, but 5 years out, 10 years out, what are you seeing?
You want me to start, Asahi, and you can jump in?
Sure.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge we have in the next 6 to 12 months is small businesses surviving, right? And surviving and competing with their bigger competitors who are public and well-funded, particularly in categories like the restaurant industry. Right? That is the single biggest existential threat that we have. Beyond that, I'm super bullish because we talked about earlier, arm the rebels, folks who are launching new companies today. Anyone launching a new company today is going to launch it on a technology platform, right? They're not going to start a business without some reliance on technology, and all the tools are there today, whether it's accounting or finance or workforce management or reaching your customers through marketing. So I'm pretty bullish on that whole scenario. I think the other thing is it's a global opportunity. If you're a seller on Shopify or BigCommerce, you may be shipping to customers in other parts of the world. And so to the extent we can continue to foster global trade, I think that's a good thing. Obviously, there are policies way above my pay grade as to how that all works, but the market is global, right? An Etsy merchant should be able to sell to 7.3 billion people. Right? Let's keep that flow of global commerce happening because it's going to create tremendous opportunities for US merchants beyond their Main Street. If I'm a storefront on Main Street, Pleasanton, California, I've traditionally sold to residents of Pleasanton, California. When I set up shop online, I'm selling all over the world. And that is going to unlock a whole wave of economic opportunity over the next 5 to 10 years that I don't even think we can really measure yet. We can sort of measure it by looking at the market capitalization of companies like eBay and Shopify and BigCommerce and others. but we're just getting started. We're in the first inning of that trend. And I think that trend is going to be massive.
Yeah, I was thinking, go ahead, Asahi. I was just going to say, when you brought up the bakery in Philadelphia, and I was thinking how I used to go up there going back and forth to New York, sometimes I'd stop in Philadelphia and go to bakeries there to get, things you can only get there. And now I can order them, but go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we're seeing is I wear two hats. I've got the work that I do with small businesses.
Right.
I also am president of the foundation, work with our philanthropic arm. And what I'm seeing is a lot of sort of purpose-driven investment where individuals are saying, I'm glad that you sell that product, but I want to know what your company stands for. I want to know what your values are. I want to know how you're contributing to the community. And as I talk with entrepreneurs across the country, whether it's in Omaha or whether we had entrepreneurs in Baltimore, each of them are talking about the purpose around their company and how they're investing in their communities. And so I think you're going to see more and more small businesses really doing that and understanding that that's part of their remit. And frankly, they were doing it already, but they're expanding into doing that. And you're seeing customers asking those questions around, I want to put my dollars to a company that I know what they stand for. The second thing I'd say is through the latest innovation of our WeOff facility with investing with the gender lens was something we added earlier this year, which is import-export, to be able to provide financing there. And that was based on feedback from our women entrepreneurs that were saying, I would like to export my business where I make cribs that are safe and babies aren't at risk for SIDS. And I want to be able to export that into Kenya or Ethiopia or into Uganda. And I want to be able to be financed to do that. And so lots of, cross-border trade and globalization of trade and having your marketplace really expand. And frankly, that was one of the things that we did earlier this year, was to allow for that kind of financing, that our women entrepreneurs would be able to get that as well. So I think that's another trend that we're seeing. I think purpose-driven and certainly the global lens.
What advice would you guys give to somebody who wanted to become an entrepreneur, who wanted to innovate a new company? You're at the end, so you can be quick. What's the sort of one-liner for people thinking about, this is something I want to do?
Talk to other entrepreneurs. I learned so much by being in the room with our entrepreneurs. They will tell you everything, the good, the bad, and the ugly, the loneliness of being an entrepreneur, all of it.
Cool. Yeah, I think this is what I do for a living, Jim, is work with entrepreneurs. So just be resilient, have confidence in yourself and be resilient. One of the biggest challenges in being an entrepreneur is the rest of the world doesn't see what you see, and believing in yourself and building something great. Again, the technology tools are there to do it. The market opportunity is there. It's bigger than it's ever been, but there's a lot of people who won't have faith in you along the way. Have confidence in yourself and be resilient.
That's a great note. Any final remarks from you guys on this topic? We covered a lot of ground, but this is your chance to say whatever the final thought is here. I have more questions. We could go on longer. I'm not going to do that. But any final thoughts?
I would just say, for this audience, I say access to capital. Our entrepreneurs need capital and finding some sort of resolution there, because I want them not only to survive, but to be able to thrive. But right now, it's existential and they need capital.
Great.
I would just add, I'm incredibly optimistic and bullish as we head into 2021. I think it's going to be, I think there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic, but I would agree with Asahi. We've got to find a way to get capital into the hands of our small businesses. It's a huge challenge for our economy, and it's just got something we've got to focus on. So thank you for shining a light on it. I appreciate it. And I hope folks in DC understand how important it is to our economy.
Absolutely. Thank
Great.
you.
Yeah, my colleagues are tired of hearing me predict that the recovery will be swift and rapid once we get a vaccine. But I think this has been a good conversation for laying out some of the things we want to do. If there's one good note that I can end on, it's that there are many in the conversation, but I think people in Washington now get the importance of small businesses and how crucial it is both for jobs and innovation. So this has been really helpful in helping guide our thinking on this. With that, we've reached the end of our time. I'd like to thank you both for doing this. It was a great session. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim.